Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. If you are looking for vendor process training for you or your entire vendor team, head over to my site at deborahrrichardson.com and click on the Vendor Team Training Solved button to learn more about what is included in the monthly or annual plan and also to download a 2021 training schedule. Get the training that you and your team needs to avoid payment fraud, duplicate vendors, compliance fines, and more. If there was a 3-step process to make sure you were 1, communicating and receiving supporting documentation from your real vendor, 2, making sure the information on that supporting documentation was accurate, and 3, once in your vendor master file, having a control in place to make sure that it really was requested by your vendor, would you use it? Well, here it is. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 144. Implement a 3-step process to change vendor banking and avoid fraud. So I don't talk about it enough on the podcast, but I really do have a 3-step process that all of my content is based on. All of my podcasts, all of my blogs. I now have a fairly new YouTube channel with Vendor Master File Tips of the Week, all my webinars. Everything I do is all based on a 3-step process. And that process is authentication, validation, and management. So authentication is the first step, and that's where you have confirmation of the vendor data source or the delivery method so that you can verify who you are communicating with and who you're accepting documents from. The second step is validation. So once you have authenticated who you're getting the information from to set up your vendor or to change vendor information, then you need to take that documentation and the data on that documentation and confirm that it is accurate. Now, the third step is management. And once you have authenticated who gave you the information, validated that the information is correct, now you have to manage that information that you have entered into your vendor master file. And with that comes lots of internal controls and best practices. But I always say this step is really important because this is where you maintain your information by either inactivating vendors that you no longer do business with, and then the vendors that remain revalidating that data so you can make sure that that information remains valid. But I am going to use that in a slightly different way in this process that we're talking about today to change vendor banking and avoiding fraud. So on that note, let's just jump right into it. So applying the authentication, validation, management 3-step process to changing vendor banking, again, we're going to start with authentication. And here is really 2 parts to it. The first part is authenticating the requester. So you need to know that who you are dealing with is the actual vendor, your real vendor. So let me just say that if you have a vendor self-registration portal and your vendor has logged in and hopefully there's MFA, multi-factor authentication to make sure it is the vendor, that really is the authentication authentication. So if they log into the vendor portal and they either update the information, the banking on their own, on their profile, or if they upload documentation to give to you to update that information in their ERP, then that's fine, because the login process of that vendor portal has authenticated who they are. But if they haven't done that and you receive those documents via email, then you need to act like your bank acts when you try to call them or communicate with them related to or regarding your account. They're not just going to talk to you. They are going to ask you 2 to 3 validations that authenticate you are who you say you are. And you need to do the same thing with your vendors. So request confirmation of 2 to 3 validations that only the vendor or employees of the vendor would know. Have 4 or 5 or more to choose from so that the same questions are not asked each time. And make sure that you have some type of a matrix and you identify those options so that whoever you have answering the phone in your accounts payable help desk or your vendor team help desk, make sure that they have a copy of that. And then the next thing is you need to authenticate the data. So once they successfully authenticate, so once your vendor requester successfully authenticates themselves, instead of just accepting their banking details on company or bank letterhead, which can be forged, or only requiring those documents, send them a company branded ACH form and require authentication on the form. Ask them for things like the existing banking details, because my thought process is if they don't know the existing bank details, then do they really have the authority to change the banking details and change where those payments are going? You can also ask for things like their tax ID. That's another piece of authenticating data. You can also ask for things that might help you in the setup or update process, like their remit address or their vendor ID if you think they have it. So you can ask for those types of things. I do have a vendor banking form that I have on my site. It is a paid resource, but it is a template that all you have to do is customize. And on that template, I ask for all of those things, plus I ask for their department contacts. So who at your company requested their services, requested their goods, so that you can reach out to them if you have any suspicions about that vendor. So you can ask for that too. And that's on the form, the company branded ACH form that's on my site. All right, so that's authentication, the first step. Now, once you have authenticated the requester and you've sent them that company branded ACH form, you're going to get that company branded ACH form back. And let me just also say that if there was a fraudster or cyber criminal that made it past authentication, they're not going to take the time to gather that information for that company branded ACH form, especially if you're asking for existing banking details, their tax ID, a person at your company that they are communicating with. Again, it makes it harder for them, and they're just going to go to the next victim or potential victim where they don't ask as many questions or require more than just that company branded or company or bank letterhead, which again can be forged. So you're making them work, they're going to go to the next one. So now that you've received that company branded ACH form back, you want to validate the bank data. Now, you definitely want to validate the routing ABA number, SWIFT or BIC code to make sure the payment will be successful. So you can't ignore the bank branch details. Banks merge and are acquired often, so you need to make sure you're using the right bank branch details. And also that the routing number can be used for the type of payment that you're trying to make, because some banks, the ACH or wire payment, there could be two separate routing numbers for those depending on the bank. So you do need to make sure of that. Now, I also have I talk about bank account ownership and that validation. And I'm actually going to include a link to a recent webinar that I did called Best Practices for Collecting and Validating Vendor Banking Details you receive via email. Now, I want to save that bank account ownership validation for that webinar because I do talk about it, but I also invited 2 additional folks as hosts on that webinar. So I have NS Knox, which is a company that has a platform that does or provides bank account ownership validation via a pre-note process. And then we also brought on a customer of theirs who talked about the pain points prior to using that solution. And then they talk about what their process looks like now after they've implemented it. So it's worth a watch. And so I will include a link to that webinar in the accompanying blog that will be linked in the show notes. So make sure you check that out because you do want to hear about bank account ownership. That's another validation that should be done. Now, the third step, management. Once you have authenticated by requiring authentication of the sender and authentication of the data received, once you validated the bank account and then updated your vendor record in your vendor master file, you need to let the vendor know that their information has been updated by sending them a notification. So it's the same way that your bank, Amazon, Hulu, Netflix, anyone online that you have changed where your information has changed in their system, they will let you know. And then they'll also say, if you did not initiate that change, then contact us. And again, you need to do the same thing with your vendors. This way, if somehow fraud and that fraudulent data did get through to the vendor master file, the vendor has a chance to contact the vendor team either before a fraudulent payment is made or before they notice the payment is missing, which increases your chances of recovery of the payment. So I know you're going to say a lot of vendors will not read the email and maybe you don't even have email addresses. And so one, if you don't have email addresses, you need to require them, which I'm sure you're doing now. But if you have vendors in your vendor master file that don't have email addresses, you need to clean that part up and add those email addresses because that's how you're going to get these notifications to them faster. I mean, I will say that we have had in the past when I've implemented that, we've had to send it as regular mail. And you know, some of your accounts do that as well. So it's no shame to send by mail, but it's faster to send by email. And both can still be faster than a vendor noticing that a payment is missing. Because we've all had that happen where a vendor will contact us a month or 6 weeks after the payment has not been made, fraudulent or not, and they're going to check up and follow up on that payment. Well, if you sent them a notification that their payment information changed, they're definitely going to get it quicker than that, whether you send it by email or by regular mail. So make sure you do those 3 steps: authentication, validation, and management, so that you can make sure that you are avoiding fraud and making sure that what's in your vendor master file is accurate and you're not making a fraudulent payment, that you are paying the right vendor. All right, so I talked about the on-demand webinar, Best Practices for Collecting and Validating Vendor Banking Details you receive via email. And you do want to watch this on-demand webinar for, again, more best practices for updating your vendor banking. I have more information in each one of the 3 steps. And again, you get to see a demonstration of NS Knox's solution for bank ownership validation. and hear from a customer using the solution and the pain points that it solved. Now, I do have a full eGuide on my authentication validation management process. It includes 5 authentication techniques, 12 internal controls, and over 13 best practices. And again, I will have a link to that in the accompanying blog post that will be linked in the show notes. Now, if you implement what's in the eGuide, there will be less potential for fraud, regulatory fines, or bad vendor data. So it's really worth a read. It's 66 pages, and I'm not like a lot of fluff. And so the eGuide is not written that way. It is only bullet points and action items. I know AP, we're all type A personalities. We don't have time for all the fluff. Bullet points and action items. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 144th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.